Hello there. Welcome to this first intuition video on dealing or mastering written questions. My name is Nathaniel Hammond. I'm one of the distance learning tutors here at Team FI. And in this video, we're going to be going through some key themes, practices and discussions that can allow you to start improving your written questions. Written questions is often an area that we commonly see weaknesses in for a lot of students, primarily on level 4, where the written content is of course more frequent, but it is also present for level 2 and 3 in certain sections. So this video has a wide application in terms of how do I start to improve my written work? Why do I always seem to get less marks in the written questions compared to the other areas of my assessments? And there are some very good things that we're going to be picking up throughout this session. Here is a summary of the things that we are going to be covering. Now, of course, as you're watching this video, you can watch all of it. You can skip to any sections that you feel are specific to you. We're going to look at setting a general foundation for written tasks. We're going to look at what we call command verbs and the role they play in your written work. Identifying the marks available or the marks awarded. Linking your writing to the scenarios. We're also going to give you guys some examples of poor work and good work and discuss the differences between them. What makes a good answer good? We're going to have a look at the AAT marking schemes, and we're also going to have a look at some general study tips that you can put into practice. So a lot to cover in this video, but a lot of really important key themes that will absolutely help you get comfortable with the questions as you progress through your AAT journey. So we're going to start by setting the foundation. Now, this section truthfully links into a lot of things that we're going to be covering throughout the remainder of the video, to be completely honest. Identifying where the marks will be awarded is one of those key points. Doing things like considering the total amount of marks available. Just as crucially, what do you need to include in your responses to gain the marks and have a good understanding of the command verbs. So basically what you're going to discover is the themes that we're going to go through in this video set the foundations for successful written tasks. The bit of truth is when somebody says to me, well, how can you teach me to write better? The answer is, well, I can't, because it depends on the type of written question. There isn't a specific way you have to write your work. You don't have to write in a certain style. You can put your own spin on it as long as you're hitting the key points the AAT want you to. And that's what we're going to start to build on as we go through these slides. We're also going to think about the marker or the audience, okay? So this section isn't something we're going into massive detail on, but it is important, so we will talk about it here. Obvious things you should be doing. Your information should be presented formally. This is not an email you are writing to a friend. This is a professional piece of work. Spelling and grammar, punctuation, making sure everything is correct. Make your work easy to mark. That's the key here. As a marker, I don't like it when I get just a block paragraph with no separations in paragraphs, no splits in sentences. It makes it more difficult. Make the marker's job easier. So the way that you start to structure your work is really important. Using things like paragraphs, capital letters, separating points, even things like bullet points may be relevant in sections. But ultimately, how easy is it to mark your work? Because the easier it is, the happier the marker will be. We always say, keep the marker sweet. Keep the marker on your side. We're also going to look at establishing links within the scenario. And this is more often than not a very common mistake that we see. And it's when people will write pretty good work, but it doesn't really have any relevance to what they are actually doing. That's going to be like the key pitfall we're going to see in a few sections. It is the key mistake we see a lot of students doing. So we're going to look at linking our writing to the scenario, either using the information provided or, depending on the type of exam you're sitting, using some information that you have discovered. So again, all the things on here, we're going to sort of delve into a little more detail on, starting with command verbs. So first of all, let's make sure we establish what actually is a command verb. So a command verb itself short and sweet, the way to describe it is a keyword in a question that instructs you on what should be included in your answer. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, when you start to do enough of the AAT's questions, you will start to notice specific patterns. You'll notice that they use certain words a lot, like identify, explain, compare. And you'll start to say, okay, well, this is in a lot of questions. Those are what we call command verbs. The command verb will be given in the question. It doesn't sort of circle it in a big red circle which stands out screaming, but you should be able to look at the requirements of the question and identify them. And what the command verb allows you to do is essentially frame your writing. So make sure you are writing about the certain thing the command verb wants you to do. We'll talk about some different examples of this on the next slide, okay? But the key point with this is these verbs are the blueprint your response should be based off. If you're asked to evaluate something, you have to evaluate it to get the marks. If you're asked to compare something, you have to make comparisons to get the mark. This is where we see the first common mistake a lot of students do. They simply will write, not necessarily bad things, but it's not within the remit of the command verb. They aren't actually writing about what the question was asking them to write about. So looking at this one here, so the Orc Fair Limited is looking to complete a sales budget. And again, we're not sort of showing the full questions, we're just using this as an example. But again, you can see the key things. Identify 4 factors, evaluate the draft overheads budget, explain the benefits. The marks will only be awarded if you do these things. And this ties in with quality over quantity. When it comes to AAT written questions, I certainly wouldn't say less is more, but more is not always the way to go. Okay, we'll talk more about that as we continue through this video. But it's the quality of your response that is measured. Just throwing loads of writing at the wall and seeing what sticks on there doesn't get you extra marks, okay? So let's have a look at an example of some command verbs. Now, you might see slightly different ones than this, but these are the key ones that you are often going to spot when you come to practice your written questions. Identify, explain, compare, recommend, maybe suggest instead of recommend, but essentially means the same thing, and evaluate. And again, you need to start getting comfortable with understanding what these things are. If you're asked to identify something, what do I need to do? If I'm asked to recommend something, what am I expected to do? This, again, is the blueprint of your written work. Question saying, here is the structure, here's the framework that your answer should be based on. If you're asked to identify something, the official description is we select, name, or otherwise characterize something. If you are asked to identify it, you say, it's this, it's that. As it says in green there, if you're identifying something, you state your facts or you make the observation and then you leave it. That's it. We just state the obvious and then move on. I don't need to go into any great detail if I'm asked to identify something. Again, this has been smart with the work that you've got to complete. Don't write 10 paragraphs of something that you've been asked to identify. You've simply been told, okay, well, it's that. I've identified it. For example, if you're asked to identify a weakness, one weakness is this. That's it. You've identified it. So move on. You've got the relevant mark. Move on to the next bit. We've then got explain, which is essentially identifying just juiced up a little bit. We're told officially it's to provide purpose or reason for something. Now, the idea behind this is it's almost like you're speaking to a toddler. And every time you tell me something, has to be evident. So as it says there, describe to the more how, the why, you're justifying your point. If you're asked to explain something, you have to explain it to me. Don't just say, this is a weakness. If I'm asked to identify a weakness and I say, this is a weakness, that's fine because I've met the requirements of the command. If I'm asked to explain why it is a weakness, and I just go, well, it is. you're not going to get any marks for that. Or if you just say it's a weakness with no context, you have to evidence your point. If you think something's a threat, why is it a threat? If you think the budget is better this year compared to last year, why? Why? What is happening for you to make that observation? Be really, really clear and evidence your points. We then have compare. Again, probably one of the more obvious ones. We essentially look at the similarities and the differences between like different items, different sets of data. I'm essentially comparing A against B. What A and B are will chop and change depending on the task that you're doing, but I'm simply making a comparison. But again, you'd be surprised at how many people fail to do this. Again, I'm looking for similarities and differences. You need to show the marker what these are. Again, common examples for like financial statements at level 4, where you compare performance indicators, primarily ratios, and you're asked to compare one year's performances against another. Maybe in applied management accounting, you're asked to compare one year's budget against the previous year's budget. You're making direct comparisons between the two. This item has improved. This item has deteriorated. Profit is better. Sales are worse. All these different things that it may or may not be. But you have to show me what they are. If you're asked to compare the profit figure from one year to the other, and you just say the profit is better, you're not going to get any marks for that. The profit from 2022 was this amount. The profit from 2023 was this amount. An overall improvement of X pounds. Again, we'll do more of this when we look at some examples of questions, okay? But for comparisons, you have to make the comparison. It sounds very obvious, but lots of people fail to do this. Tell the marker everything. What you see in terms of like the scenario, the question, the information. Assume that the person reading this cannot see that information. You can't just say, this has got better, because I want to see some figures. I want to see some percentages. I want to see some data that shows and highlights those differences, okay? We've also got recommend. And again, you probably can hazard a guess at what we need to do with this one. Officially, we suggest a preferred option or a course of action, providing clear evidence to support it. Okay, so again, if you're asked to recommend something in a question, you have to make a recommendation to get the marks. If you fail to do so, doesn't matter what you write. If you haven't actually provided a recommendation, you're not getting the relevant marks. Again, a common mistake we see, not that people can't write, it's not that they are simply writing about the incorrect things. If you're asked to make a suggestion or a recommendation, give it. That is what awards you marks. And as it says in green, you give your suggestion, and key to this, justify why it's beneficial. Again, you're going back to that toddler approach. If you said to me, I recommend this is the best next step, I'm going to say, okay, well, why? Why do you think it's the next best step? Be prepared to justify your answers. It's really important in these written questions. Any points that you are making based on your interpretations have to be justified. So validate your answers. Don't just say, I'm going to increase my expenses for next year on the budget. Okay, well, why? Why have you recommended that? What has driven you to that point? Again, contextualize it. The marker can't see what you see in these scenarios. And last but not least, we've got evaluate. So we make a fair judgment based on a range of factors using available knowledge, experiences, and evidence. Key to this, essentially, you're sitting on the fence. You're being objective. If you're asked to evaluate something, consider the advantages and disadvantages. Be neutral, okay? You're not recommending this is what I think should be done. You're evaluating something. So you might need to summarize the point. But again, the difference is, if I'm asked to evaluate something, I'm not going to say, well, you shouldn't do that. You should do this instead. Because again, that's not what the question wants me to do. It's not asking me to recommend what the best path is. It's saying, okay, these are my options. Evaluate them for me. Why is one maybe a bit better than the other? What are the advantages of going down option A? What are the advantages of option B? What are the drawbacks of each one? And overall, what can you tell me about these different things? Okay. Now, again, you will see these sort of command verbs pop up in different questions. And as we sort of look at other examples throughout this video, again, you'll see command verbs coming into play. You have to understand the role and the requirement to include responses that meet the demands of the command verb. We'll talk more about that as we're going through. But again, really, really important stuff. Make sure you understand, because this is rookie mistake 101. People write these fantastic written questions, but when you actually look at what the question wanted them to do, they've not met the requirements because they haven't actually paid attention to the command verb. They might as well not put anything there. Now, tied in with this point, we're going to also look at understanding where the marks are awarded, identifying the marks available in questions. Now, again, this sounds pretty obvious, doesn't it? Because when you look at these tasks, it says, like for example, here on this part A of a question, identify weaknesses in this process, explain the impact on you and the company, and it literally says there, 12 marks. So we know how many marks are available, but do we really know how those marks are awarded? And this is what we're referring to when we're talking about identifying the marks available. This is another very common mistake that we see. As it says there, you need to understand how, in this example, those 12 marks are provided, or how are they awarded. This is a skill that you do need to build up, but it's really useful once you come to grips with it. As it says here, the AAT will only award a select number of marks in every single section of a question. So sometimes you can write, again, the most fantastic, detailed response, but it might be capped at 2 marks. And again, this is why you need to understand. This ties in a lot with time management. People do this all the time. I've seen people spend 20 minutes responding to a task that's worth 2 marks. It's a complete waste of time. It's a complete poor performance in terms of time management. Understand, okay, well, what actually gets me marks? Okay. And we're going to look at this sort of example here about the impacts and the weaknesses on the company, like so. So this 12 marks is actually awarded as follows. So I need to identify 4 weaknesses and explain the impact on me and the company. Now, again, we don't know what the question is, but we don't need to for the purposes of this illustration. The marks are awarded as follows. For every weakness I identify, I will gain 1 mark. For every potential impact on me I have explained, I will gain a mark. For every impact on the company, which is Downton in this example, I will gain a mark. And as it says on the right-hand side of the screen, these are very common mistakes that we see. You can very easily lose marks by doing this. So for example, if you complete 3 out of the 4, so again, you give me weakness 1, 2, and 3, and you've listed the impacts, you've lost 3 marks straight away. Doesn't matter how well you have described those 3 and identified the weakness and explained the impact. Doesn't matter how much detail you've given me, you've missed 3 marks. If you miss one of the potential impact columns, so again, you tell me about the weakness, but then you only tell me about the impact on you, as opposed to also including the impact on Downton, you've lost 4 marks. Again, it doesn't matter what else you've written or the quality of your responses, you've lost 4 marks, which is a lot. You know, it's a third of the marks available in these tasks just by not writing about the right things. And as it says there, another common mistake we see, sometimes people will just write the weaknesses and they'll say, okay, well, this is a weakness, and they won't tell you anything else. Well, by doing that, you lose 8 marks. And again, these are very common mistakes that we see. This is what you need to start doing. When you look at written questions, you need to sort of program your brain to look at the screen, like we can see here, and say, okay, well, if those 1 marks on the screen weren't there, where would I put them? Can I see that within those 12 marks, where do I actually get them? Because I will not get 12 marks if I just write loads of detail about 2 weaknesses and their impacts. I'm going to lose a lot. So again, being smart about how you write, knowing where the marks are awarded. We've got another example of this here. So in this one, again, it's just another generic example. It says, explain the stages of the life cycle how costs can behave and change, and a suggestion on how these could be managed. Now, again, the marks are given to you. 1 mark for part 1, 2 marks for part 2, 1 mark for part 3. But again, we see very common errors in tasks like this. Again, a lot of this revolves around time management. The first part is a maximum of 1 mark. The second part is a maximum of 2. The final part is a maximum of 1. Now, what that means is if you only write about part 2, you are only going to get 2 of the marks out of the 4 available. If you write loads and loads and loads about the stages of the product's life cycle and you go into really beautiful detail, you're going to get 1 mark and nothing else. So again, the key thing here is you have to understand the AAT will cap marks available. You cannot get 4 out of 4 marks in a question like this for giving me loads of detail about half of it. To get the full marks, you need to have a rounded approach. And as it says there, these common mistakes, writing too much in sections with a single mark available. Again, I've seen students spend 15, 20 minutes on questions like this for 1 mark. It is not a good use of your time in your exams. And as it says again, certain sections have a capped limit. You will never earn more than that. You'll never earn more than 2 marks in part 2. You will never earn more than 1 mark in parts 1 and 3. So keep that in mind and structure your writing appropriately. And equal to that, sometimes people will not write enough in the sections where more marks are available. Why? Common issues. A, they simply just don't know enough about it. If I don't know enough about part 2, maybe if I write more in part 1, I'll get more marks. No, you won't. Again, you'll be capped at 1 mark for part 1. You'll have lost marks for your second question. Another common issue with this is, again, people will think that the more I write in another section, the better I'll do overall. It doesn't work like that. Think about the marks available. And people will sometimes ask, well, how many words should I write? So what's the difference between writing a 1 mark question and a 2 mark question? Like, is it a sentence? Is it a paragraph? I don't know how much I should write. Again, there's not a definitive answer because it depends on the context of the question. But again, ultimately, be smart. You shouldn't be spending 15 minutes on a question worth 1 mark. Make your points. Have you sort of fulfilled the requests of the question? And then you move on. Tying in with all this is how we link into the scenarios provided. And again, this is another common issue. Sometimes people struggle to contextualize the information on the screen. And then we get essentially what I'd call generic questions or generic responses in line with the question. This doesn't fly with the AAT, to be completely honest with you. You are expected to know, okay, well, this is the scenario, so this is what I'm going to write about. We're going to talk about this point over the next couple of slides. But as it says, in most, pretty much all written questions, you get like a bit of a scenario. You're almost role-playing a little bit. So it will say like, you work in the accounts office of this fictitious company. So it sort of puts you in these little role-playing scenarios. And then it will give you sort of information about what is happening. Now, when I come to write, any sort of points I make, anything I explain, any recommendations that I make should link to the scenario to gain good marks, okay? So what I'm writing about, I should be able to draw a line from my point to a section in the scenario that it references, not word for word, but again, if I'm talking about, well, there was a deterioration in net profit because of an increase in the rent figure, I should be able to say, okay, well, that statement links to the point in the scenario where it says rent costs increased, okay? Let's just put this into a bit of practice. Again, we're going to have to highlight our attention to detail. You will sometimes have to find the information yourself, or you'll just highlight it across. And there's an example of it here. Now, I'm not going to read this out word for word. You can pause the video and read through this task if you wish. But ultimately, what we're being requested to do is identify 3 potential problems in the plans above and evaluate the impact on the organisation. Again, a lot of people struggle with these. Poor responses. What makes a poor response in this example? Well, I'm told to identify 3 problems. A poor response that does not gain marks essentially makes something up. Within the information on the screen, I should be able to find 3 problems. And again, I should be able to, in my mind, draw a line from the problem I'm identifying to something on the screen that has implied that is a problem. So this is a problem, that's a problem. My point should link back to the scenario. Common mistakes we see with stuff like this is people will just make stuff up. And when I look for that, okay, well, where's the link? There's nothing in the scenario that implies this is a problem. This commonly happens when people do things like a SWOT analysis or even a pestle analysis at times where they're sort of asked to identify threats. The threat should link to the scenario. Don't just make a random threat up and say, oh, well, there is a threat that the warehouse might get burgled or a fire might destroy the factory. It's complete invaluable information to us. The threats have to link to the points. And then equal to that, other things a poor response will do is describe an impact, because you'll see this a lot in these questions. It will say, identify the threat. How do I reduce the risk of the threat? Identify a problem. What is the impact of the problem? And again, poor responses will describe an impact that is either unrealistic or not relevant. Again, I shouldn't be talking about, well, there might be a fire in the warehouse and the warehouse might burn down and then the company will have to move and there'll be laws like, it's just, you're making stuff up. You know, you're just on beyond the realms of any sort of logical theory. You're just speculating, okay? What could the actual impact be? An example on this one. So again, I've just pulled out a couple here for what it's worth. A good response identifies problems that can be traced back. So I could write about how it's a problem that this company has decided it's no longer going to reconcile its supplier statements. That is a problem. And I can state it and in my mind, draw that line back to the section of the scenario that tells me about it, okay? And then I can describe a realistic impact in line with the problem. And okay, so what is the problem with no longer doing reconciliations? Well, if I'm not reconciling supplier statements, there's a reasonable chance that invoices might get missed, credit notes might get missed, overpayments, underpayments, any sort of issues in terms of like supplier relations could be impacted. So again, it's a realistic response in line with the problem I've stated. What I'm not saying is, okay, well, I've identified the problem. I said that the company has now decided it's no longer going to reconcile. So what's the impact? Okay, well, it might mean that one of our suppliers falls out with us and then we have to go and buy it from somewhere else. Or the supplier that's fallen out with us, we've got a good relationship with them. So maybe we don't deal with them anymore. Again, it's not relevant. Be realistic. What is the issue? Well, if I'm not reconciling supplier statements, there's a fair chance that payments either are going to be too much or too little because I'm not checking what is coming into the account. That's the key point here. Your responses, your work should always link back to the scenario, especially on questions like this. If I'm talking about strengths and weaknesses, if I'm doing a pestle analysis, if I'm comparing ratios, the AAT will give you what you need. You might have to do a tiny bit of calculation work. Maybe it gives you the information to work out ratios, and then you have to work them out yourself. But again, that's all it is. It's just an extra calculation, but it still all links to the scenario. This, again, is a mega mistake we see very, very commonly. And in my opinion, this is where the majority of people lose the most marks. It's not that you can't write, but you're just not actually thinking about the information presented to you. Your writing should trace back to these key points. And while we're talking about work, let's have a look at some examples now. So these are examples based off actual student responses with some very slight alterations for privacy purposes. What I would hate to happen is a student sort of goes, hang on a minute, I recognise that writing, that was me. I don't want that to happen. So we have made some minor alterations just for privacy reasons. We're going to look at a written question, the business awareness at level 3, and drafting and interpreting financial statements at level 4. And again, what makes an answer good and what makes an answer poor. Now, again, as markers, it's bread and butter for us, but you should get to the point where you can do this yourselves. You need to get comfortable with marking your own work. We'll talk more about that later, but understanding the quality of your responses. Is it good? Is it bad? What was strong in my response? What was poor in my response? That's how you get better at written questions, understanding it. So we'll start with business awareness. Now, again, the task is on the screen. I'm not going to read through it word for word. You can pause the video at this point if you wish to read through it yourself, okay? But the bottom line is we're asked to complete a pestle analysis for a couple of specific categories. And then there is also a little part 2 here where we explain an action that could be taken to reduce the threats under each category. So again, this ties in with linking to the scenario. If I'm doing a pestle analysis, political, economical, social, technological, etc., the points should link back to these paragraphs. Any factors that are present should link to these points. I can't make stuff up, okay? So let's have a look at a response like so. So we're told social. New competitors aren't selling direct to market. They're selling through concessions and intermediary stores. For political, the government will increase the tax on the business. Environmental, most products are currently made of plastic. The government's new tax will research sustainability projects. Actions, we should do the same. Look to make products from more sustainable places. Look into making alternative products from a non-plastic material. Now, again, there's a lot of writing here, arguably, but not a lot of substance. Issues that stand out to me as a marker immediately. Now, the social threat is actually copy and pasted word for word. If I just flick back very quickly and you pause the video, you'll see that it actually says new competitors are not necessarily selling direct. It's literally just been copied word for word and pasted through to this response. That's not right, okay? I need to see you can interpret it as a threat. Don't just copy and paste it word for word. Again, you're going to reference the points, but I want to see you reference the point. I don't want to see you just write it out word for word, because as a marker, I'm saying, well, have you actually interpreted that correctly? Do you understand that, or are you just guessing, copying it? And equal to that, the social threat in this example isn't actually a social threat. New competitors are not selling through the direct market and are going through intermediary stores. That's not a social issue here. Arguably, that's an economical one. So again, common mistakes we see, you're just writing about the wrong thing. What they're saying is, okay, it looks very professional, but it's wrong. It's not a social threat. So you won't get any marks for it. It doesn't belong in this category. Equal to that, the action to reduce the social threat is rubbish. We should do the same. That's not an action to reduce the threat. Again, there's no sort of evidence to this point. There's no sort of evaluation. There's no explanation. Why would I do that? How does that reduce the threat? We should do the same. That's not an adequate response. And again, we see ones like this very often. You should tell me, this is the action. This is why the action reduces the threat. That's what the question wants you to do. Looking at the political column, we're told the government will increase tax on the business. Well, no, it doesn't actually say that. Again, if you go back to the written scenario, it says that the government is considering, they are discussing imposing an additional tax. That is what we would call an absolute reference. And we do say, try your best to avoid them in these questions. It's not saying the government will. The government may consider. The government is debating. So to say that they are doing this is not correct. And equal to that, again, you haven't told me why a tax increase is a threat. Now, again, it will sound obvious because, well, if it's more tax, it's less profit. It's obvious. Yes, it is obvious to you. Assume the marker doesn't know. Again, assume that the person you're giving this information to doesn't know anything about this. You have to tell them. The threat here is increased taxation equals reduced profitability. That is the threat. You have to tell the marker. Do not assume that they can make that deduction themselves, okay? Again, it's almost like you're doing a bit of role playing in these tasks. The person, the manager, whoever it is you're talking to, assume that they do not understand any of this. You're having to explain all of your points. Again, this is a very common mistake that we see because people think, well, I know how it works, so I'll explain it like that. That's great for you, but you've just done weeks and weeks of study to understand these topics. What if I haven't? I don't know what it means. Be prepared to tell me. Evidence your points. Assume I don't know. Equal to that, it says look to make products from more sustainable places. Again, it says there's no link to how sustainable products reduce the threat of increased tax. Because again, these points tie in with each other. Because I've explained the threat poorly, my action to reduce the threat is also really, really poor. Because, well, why does making more sustainable products reduce my tax? Well, it's because it's going to be an environmental tax, but I haven't told the marker that. Again, I haven't made links back to the scenario effectively enough. And finally, for environmental, we're told most products are currently made of plastic. The government's new tax will research sustainability projects. I'm told to look into making alternative products from a non-plastic material. Now, the action to reduce the threat there is actually, I'd say it's relevant. I'd say it's good. I'd say you get marks for it. But why have I given two threats? Or why have I given sort of two separate points? Most products are currently made of plastic. The government's new tax will research sustainability projects. Why have I made two separate points there? That's not what the question wanted me to do. Now, truthfully, I wouldn't even say that's two threats, because the bottom one, is it really a threat? I wouldn't say so. But again, I'm not asked to write more than one. And again, this is a very common mistake. I don't need that much information. One threat in each section. You will not get extra marks for writing more. Sometimes, if you write too much, you'll actually lose marks. It's what we call the scattergun approach. Essentially, you're just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks on. I'm not sure which threat is an environmental one, so I'll put 5. That says to me as a marker, okay, I don't think you actually understand here which is a real threat, and then you can't tell me why, okay? Now let's look at the same question from a more positive light. And let's see what we can identify. Now, straight away, the difference is night and day. Not just in terms of the amount of text. Don't fall into that assumption that writing more automatically means I get more marks. It's about the quality of the writing. There's a little more in terms of quantity, but it's the quality that's really different here. Look at the social one. Customers are interested in sustainability. They are becoming more aware of their impact on the environment. This includes one of the key customer groups. There is a threat of future losses in revenue due to this change in consumer opinion. So can you see here, this is the social threat. There is a change in sort of buying habits from my core customer group. So I am under threat of losing future revenue. And then the action, we should make sure that we're in line with practices, switch to recyclables, basically keep up with the customer's needs to try and maintain our market share. Really simple. I've identified a threat. It's relevant for social factors. I've explained, okay, well, this is why it's a threat, and my action resolves it or reduces it. Resolves is the wrong word, to be fair. We can never remove it completely, but we want to reduce it as much as possible. So if I'm saying that my products don't meet the sustainability demands of my customers, well, looking to make sustainable products that do is a great way of reducing the risk of them going elsewhere. And all of that links back to the scenario. Let's look at the political one. The government may, not will, pose an additional tax on businesses that do not use resources from sustainable sources. This proposed tax threatens precious pendants profitability. So again, just look at the difference between what we just did and the one we're doing now. First of all, the word is correct. The government may impose an additional tax. It's not been confirmed yet. There is a threat of it happening. But I'm also saying why. Again, I know that more tax equals less profit, but does the person that I'm speaking to know that? I'm not going to assume so. The proposed tax threatens our profitability. Now, how do I reduce the threat? Well, as we currently use plastics that are not recyclable, we should look to make sure we source and try and find alternatives that meet regulations and would avoid any potential tax increases. So how do I avoid the risk of increased tax? Well, I look at altering my products to make sure that I meet the sustainability requirements. Therefore, I don't actually have to pay the additional tax. But again, can you see the key difference here? It's night and day. The quality of the response is so much stronger. The threat is present. The action to reduce it is relevant, and it makes more sense because I've talked about the problem is more tax. So this, how do we revolve around it? Well, we change our operations to avoid it. Again, everything links together. For the last one, although alternative products / materials are currently under consideration, the current plastics used are non-recyclable, threatening to further damage the environment. So again, we've explained very clearly what the issue is, non-recyclable products, and the threat is, well, it's environmentally damaging. How do we reduce the threat? Well, again, we can look at sort of accelerating this process. We can promote these sustainable products and promote that positive impact on the environment. So again, it ticks all the boxes for me as a marker. They've explained what they think the threat is, why they think it's a threat. Again, the threat is sometimes obvious. If it's an environmental factor, the threat is probably going to be some form of damage to the environment. That's it. And then the action to reduce it. Well, again, let's produce products that don't do that. Again, clear differences. Now let's do the same again for a level 4 drafting and interpreting financial statements question. Now, again, I'm not going to read through it word for word. I'm just going to put it up on the screen. You can pause the video and read through it at your leisure. We're going to focus on a couple of things here. So first of all, it says, for each ratio, is the ratio better or worse compared to the previous year? And explain what this may tell you about the company. Now, just to sort of keep things compact on the screen, I can't slap a full question on the PowerPoint slide. We're going to sort of compact this. So we're just going to focus on the gross profit margin and the gearing ratio, okay? That's just for the purposes of our illustration. Of course, in the question, you'd talk about everything you've got. But again, just to keep things neat and tidy, we're going to focus on a couple of ratios specifically. And again, as we're going through this, can you start to see the command verbs? Identify whether each ratio is better or worse. Explain what the comparison may tell you. That's what you need to do. So we have a look. So here's an example of a pretty poor effort. Gross profit, first of all, is it better or worse? Gross profit is better than before. What might this tell you about the company? The company is making more profit. This is because of lower costs, like wages and rent. Gearing has increased to 56%. This is not good for the company. What might this tell us? The company has worse gearing than last year, meaning they are riskier. Now, again, we see responses like this. There are a lot of problems. Truthfully, if your written questions look like this, you should not be anywhere near a live assessment because there's a lot of issues that need addressing, okay? The key one is around figures, and this is a very common one we see on things like AMAC and drafting and interpreting financial statements. You need to use figures to inform the marker. Again, assume that all of this information, the revenues, the profits, I can't see it. So you say to me, gross profit is better than before. The first thing I'm going to say in response is, well, by what? Like, you haven't told me. There's no context to the figures that you've given me. How much is it improved by? That's the first issue. And what does this tell me about the company? Well, actually, again, in this section, it's wrong. Because the gross profit is my sales minus my cost of sales. Things like wages and rent are overheads. So that would affect my net profit. So that statement is also technically incorrect. It doesn't award me marks. It looks very professional, but it's wrong. So guess what? Unfortunately, you don't get anything for it. Key issues there. Well, look at the gearing one. The figure's given, but again, there's no context to it. Gearing has increased to 56%. Well, again, the first thing I would say back to you is, well, it's increased from what? Has it increased from 10%? 55%? How do I know? You haven't told me what the change has been. And again, use figures to illustrate your points. We'll see it in a good example in a minute. And then saying that, okay, this is not good for the company. Okay, well, why? As it says there, when we're looking at what this may tell you, we're saying that they are riskier. But what does that mean? How are they riskier? Again, you aren't giving me confirmation or any contextualization in your responses. This, to me, looks like a student that doesn't actually understand what these ratios focus on. And that bleeds through to the writing. You can sometimes, skip through a calculation or two, even if you're not 100% sure how it works. You can't do that on written questions. And again, I will look at this one from a mile away and say, yeah, no, you don't actually know what gearing does. Why is it not? What is the risk? Tell me about it. And again, on both of these, it's just there's a lack of information here. What are these ratios doing? What is it telling me? Now compare that with this one, okay? Now, again, as I'm looking at this, there's a little bit more writing, but again, that doesn't mean we fall under the guise of quality and quantity. Just writing more doesn't mean I get more marks automatically. The quality of my work dictates the pace. Now, again, there is a bit of a correlation, but we'll see. Look at the gross profit one. And again, look at the key issues that we just spoke about and how we address them here. The gross profit margin has improved, increasing 2% overall from 47 to 49%. Again, there is a clear difference. In terms of the actual overall quantity of writing, there's really not actually a lot extra here. But just by adding a couple of figures, it makes it so much easier for a reader to understand. I can look at that and I know immediately what has happened. Okay, it's gone up from 47 to 49, 2% overall. Perfect. What does this tell me about the company? Well, again, the company must be more profitable in this period. Clearly, because it's gone up. Again, making good points here. Why? This may be due to an increase in selling prices, which correlates with the increase in revenue, or the negotiation of better prices from our suppliers. Now, again, if you go back a couple of minutes to the scenario and pause the screen, you'll see that the revenue figure has improved. So maybe that is why the gross profit has increased. But again, I've given examples of what may have impacted this. Let's look at the gearing one. And again, let's look at the differences in these answers. The gearing ratio has worsened overall, increasing from 29 to 56%, a deterioration of 27% in total. Again, I'm just using the figures I can very easily identify to my advantage. Contextualize your points. What does this tell me? Well, gearing measures the financial risk of the company by considering the long-term finance already in place. The worsening of the ratio indicates the company is financed by more debt than the previous period. Investigations would need to take place to ascertain what this increase was used for. Perfect. A perfect response. I would look at this and say, okay, whoever's written that knows exactly what gearing does. Again, look at the difference in where we're talking about gearing. One sentence, couple of sentences, but again, it's evident. Example B knows exactly what gearing does. It measures financial risk. It looks at long-term debt. So the fact this has gotten worse, that implies that we've taken more debt on. Really strong, valid observations. This is like a full mark response, okay? And just look at them. Again, you can pause the video, go back and forward, look at the differences in quality. This is the standard of work you should be working towards. Now we've got the last couple of slides to run through, and then we are done. We'll now look at marking schemes, which are useful for a couple of different reasons. I think the core of what we're sort of covering has been covered, to be completely honest. We have SAMs, sample assessment marking schemes. We're going to talk about, okay, well, why did the AAT make them? Why did they release them? And how do you use them? What does it look like? Well, we're going to basically answer all that in the next couple of slides, to be completely honest with you. We're also going to look at banded mark schemes, okay? Because, again, when you completed AAT work, you will see that when you come to look at the answers, you are given a marking scheme for the written work, be it SAM scheme or a banded marking scheme. you need to know how these work because it allows you to become a marker. People always say this, like, how do I get better at written work? Just say, well, A, do it, and B, mark it. Mark your own written work. Can you see where you get marks? Can you see where you drop marks? More about that in a little bit. Here's an example of a marking scheme. So here, you'll notice that it's quite generic, isn't it? So like it says, for 1 to 2 marks, the answer states that the layout and presentation of the operating statement is poor, but with limited evidence to support the judgment. To access higher marks in the band, the answer should give simple explanation of why the layout and presentation is poor. No recommendation is given in the answer. Because this is the thing, as I said, you don't have to learn to write in a specific way. That's not the objective of the AAT. Things like these sample assessment marking schemes, the purpose of them is essentially a framework that your work is evaluated against. You will write a response differently than me, but that doesn't mean that mine's better than yours or yours is better than mine. We will use the SAMs to make that comparison. So you can see that for the more marks you are awarded, the more complex it gets. So for like 5 to 7, the answer states that the layout and presentation is poor, includes comprehensive assessment of the layout, including a range of well-explained relevant points as evidence for their judgment. These are the sort of things that the markers will use in certain parts of your work, okay? And again, you'll notice it's not saying that you have to write this specific word. You have to say these specific things. It's not what it's trying to do, okay? It just gives you an idea of the sort of thing you need to start including. So I would look at this and say, okay, in order to get more marks in this question, I need to state the layout is poor. I need to essentially go through and explain why and provide evidence to that point. I also need to give a recommendation. So again, by using these, you can start to see where the marks come from. Make the point, evidence it, make a recommendation. If I miss one of those 3 key elements, I'm not going to fall into that 5 to 7 mark band here. I'd probably fall a bit further behind, wouldn't I? And you'll see this. Again, I use these for students and I say, look at them and come back to me. Look at that and you tell me, okay, well, what gets you 1 or 2 marks? What gets you 7? Can you see the key differences that you need to start including in your work? We've also got banded mark schemes. So again, these are slightly different, and then you will see these through time as well. So these sort of look at a range of acceptable responses. So does your answer sort of fit in the band of acceptable responses? Because you, for example, in a question where you have to write 4 weaknesses, you might write some different weaknesses than the person next to you. But again, it doesn't mean that yours are right and theirs are wrong, or vice versa. We have these banded marking schemes. So it's like it says this is the range of answers that we would deem acceptable. It's the full range, okay? As it says there, that not all of these points have to be present to obtain full marks. They just don't, okay? So again, it says like 4 weaknesses. The model answer might have 10 different ones, but it's saying this is the band which we would deem acceptable responses. Anything that falls on there is fine. And you might also see, and I'm certain you will, when you look at model answers, it sometimes says things like, although relevant points may be awarded marks. So again, sometimes you might give me a suggestion that isn't actually in the banded mark scheme. But if it's saying that other relevant points may be awarded marks, what that is telling me is that, okay, if I've made an observation or whatever it may be, it is correct and it meets the requirements of the question, you can still get marks for it. Okay, that's what it's trying to say about that. When you see this section, other relevant points, if you've written something that isn't on the banded scheme, ask yourself, okay, well, is it still factually correct? And is it relevant to the question? If the answer to both of those is yes, then you'll still get a mark for it. Okay, again, the beauty, difficulty, depends on what perspective you look at it from, with these is that it comes down to interpretation, okay? Now, last but not least, just some quick, easy study tips. What sort of brings all this together? First of all, it's about recapping your knowledge. Written questions people always sort of separate calculation and written questions. You have these two very distinct elements in the mind. It's an extension of the knowledge that you should have already gained. You don't write about things you've never seen before. The AAT are basically turning up the pressure and they're saying to you, okay, I know you can calculate things like this, but can you tell me about them? Because people will say, well, I don't get the point of written questions. Why do I do them? Very easily reason for that. Because in a real world scenario, if somebody says, okay, well, why are you doing that? If your manager says, explain to me what you've just done, you have to be able to do that. That is the point of written questions. So again, it's just an extension of the core knowledge you're studying. Utilize all the resources available to you. Without stating the obvious, revision sessions, materials, lectures, anything you can get your hands on about written theory or practicing written questions, use it. What we often see, and this ties in with the next point about completing as many examples as possible, because people don't like written questions, and because it is generally the weakest area that we see, more often than not, people actually avoid them because they don't like doing them. That only makes it worse. Avoiding written questions is a surefire way to make sure you never actually improve them. Do not do this. Practice them as many as you can get your hands on. And if you have a tutor, get any work, get it marked. Can you tell me how many marks I got? Where did I get marks? Where did I drop marks? Can you see things in my writing that would imply it's good, it's great, it needs improving? Let the tutors that you have give you their expertise, okay? You can also look at the examiner's reports. Now, the examiner's reports we have for every single unit on the AAT syllabus, levels 2, 3, and 4, which summarises the live attempts of that exam over the past 12 months. It lists what students did well, and what students struggled with. For the written tasks, go to the written tasks on the examiner's report and look at some of those common mistakes. Look at the areas that a lot of people are struggling with. And the last but not least is a little personal favourite exercise of mine that we call critical reflection. Now, the purpose of critical reflection is, again, it sort of puts the emphasis back on you. You will get better at written tasks if you start to understand what does and doesn't work well in your writing, okay? What do? Step one, you complete a written task without looking at the answers. Be honest with yourself. Step two, once you've done that, you mark your work yourself. Again, focusing on, can I see where I got marks? Can I see where I dropped marks? Step three, once you've done that, send it over to your tutor. Here is the work I completed. I gave myself 10 out of 15. What do you think? And then again, you can start to understand your own work. The whole point of critical reflection is it forces you to evaluate what you do. You will identify, okay, well, I write about these things really well. I struggle with these things. Well, why do I struggle with those things? What about it? What am I missing in my writing? What else do I need to include? It forces you to look at the work, which you just simply have to do, okay? But with that, that actually brings us to the end of this video. So I'd like to thank you all for watching. I hope you found the themes and topics useful. As it says there, we're an outstanding Ofsted provider. We've got multiple awards floating around. We do all sorts of these different sessions. Please do get in touch if there's anything we can do to help. But as I said, I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing sort of your written theory and your written questions as you progress through your studies.